Yemeni Civil War, 2015 to 2018, Humanitarian Situation. CNN reported on April 8, 2015 that almost 10,160,000 Yemenis were deprived of water, food, and electricity as a result of the conflict. The report also added per sources from UNICEF officials in Yemen that within 15 days, some 100,000 people across the country were dislocated, while Oxfam said that more than 10 million Yemenis did not have enough food to eat, in addition to 850,000 half-starved children. Over 13 million civilians were without access to clean water. A medical aid boat brought 2.5 tons of medicine to Aden on April 8, 2015. A UNICEF plane loaded with 16 tons of supplies landed in Sana'a on 10 April. The United Nations announced on 19 April 2015 that Saudi Arabia promised to provide $273.7 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Yemen. The UN appealed for the aid, saying 7.5 million people had been affected by the conflict and many were in need of medical supplies, potable water, food, shelter, and other forms of support. On May 12, 2015, Oxfam warned that the 5 days a humanitarian ceasefire was scheduled to last would not be sufficient to fully address Yemen's humanitarian crisis. It has also been said that the Houthis are collecting a war tax on goods. The political analyst Abdul Ghani al-Aryani affirmed that this tax is an illegal levy, mostly extortion that is not determined by law, and the amount is at the discretion of the field commanders. As the war dragged on through the summer and into the fall, things were made far worse when Cyclone Chapala, the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane, made landfall on November 3, 2015. According to the NGO Save the Children, the destruction of healthcare facilities and a healthcare system on the brink of collapse as a result of the war will cause an estimated 10,000 preventable child deaths annually. Some 1,219 children have died as a direct result of the conflict thus far. Edward Santiago, the NGO's Yemen director, asserted in December 2016. Even before the war, tens of thousands of Yemeni children were dying of preventable causes. But now, the situation is much worse and an estimated 1,000 children are dying every week from preventable killers like diarrhea, malnutrition and respiratory tract infections. On March 2017, the World Food Programme reported that while Yemen was not yet in a full-blown famine, 60% of Yemenis, or 17 million people, were in crisis or emergency food situations. In June 2017, a cholera epidemic resurfaced which was reported to be killing a person an hour in Yemen by mid-June. News reports in mid-June stated that there had been 124,000 cases and 900 deaths and that 20 of the 22 provinces in Yemen were affected at that time. UNICEF and WHO estimated that, by June 24, 2017, the total cases in the country exceeded 200,000, with 1,300 deaths. On June 7, 2018, it was reported that the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, had pulled 71 of its international staff out of Yemen, and moved the rest of them to Djibouti, with some 450 ICRC employees remaining in the country. The partial evacuation measure came on the eve of an ICRC worker, a Lebanese national, being killed on 21 April by unknown gunmen in the southwestern city of Taiz. The ICRC stated, "Our current activities have been blocked, threatened and directly targeted in recent weeks, and we see a vigorous attempt to instrumentalize our organization as a pawn in the conflict." In light of the serious security deterioration for ICRC personnel, the international organization has called for all parties of the conflict to provide it with concrete, solid and actionable guarantees so that it can continue working in Yemen. Since the beginning of the conflict, more than 10,000 people have been killed and at least 40,000 wounded, mostly from air raids. War crime accusations. According to Faria al-Muslim, direct war crimes have been committed during the conflict. For example, an IDP camp was hit by a Saudi airstrike, while Houthis have sometimes prevented aid workers from giving aid. The UN and several major human rights groups discuss the possibility that war crimes may have been committed by Saudi Arabia during the air campaign. Human Rights Watch, HRW, wrote that the Saudi-led air campaign that began on March 26, 2015, had conducted airstrikes in apparent violation of the laws of war, such as the March 30 attack on a displaced persons camp in Mazraq, northern Yemen, that struck a medical facility and a market. HRW also said that the Houthis had unlawfully deployed forces in densely populated areas and used excessive force against peaceful protesters and journalists. In addition, HRW said that by providing logistical and intelligence assistance to coalition forces, the United States may have become a party to the conflict, creating obligations under the laws of war. Other incidents noted by HRW that had been deemed as indiscriminate or disproportionate or in violation of the laws of war were a strike on a dairy factory outside the Red Sea port of Hodeidah, 31 civilian deaths, a strike that destroyed a humanitarian aid warehouse of the international aid organization Oxfam in Sada, the Saudi Arabia-led coalition's blockade of Yemen which kept out fuel desperately needed for the Yemeni population's survival. Amnesty International said that several Saudi Arabian-led airstrikes, documented by it, hit 5 densely populated areas, Sada, Sana'a, Hodeidah, Haja'anib, and raised concerns about compliance with the rules of international humanitarian law. Amnesty International added that according to its research, at least 139 people, including at least 97 civilians, 33 of whom were children, were killed during these strikes, and 460 individuals were injured, at least 157 whom are civilians. HRW also said that pro-Houthi fighters may have committed war crimes when 2 women were killed in Yemen and 8 workers were arrested for 2 weeks. U.N. Humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, Johannes van der Klauw, said that airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition on Sada city in Yemen, where many civilians were trapped, were in breach of international humanitarian law, despite calls for civilians to leave the area. Scores of civilians were reportedly killed and thousands forced to flee their homes after the Saudi-led coalition declared the entire governorate a military target, he said. Van der Klauw also said that coalition strikes had targeted schools and hospitals, in breach of international law. A group of 17 aid agencies working in Yemen condemned the growing intensity of airstrikes in the north of Yemen on 8 and May 9, 2015. Save the Children's Country Director in Yemen, Edward Santiago, said that the indiscriminate attacks after the dropping of leaflets urging civilians to leave Sada raises concerns about the possible pattern being established in breach of international humanitarian law. Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor has claimed that Houthi militias in alliance with the militants of exiled former President Ali Abdullah Saleh killed purposely at least 22 civilians in Taiz. According to eyewitnesses, the militants launched Katyusha rockets targeting the markets and residential neighborhoods in the center of Taiz. As a result, many civilians were killed and wounded. On the other hand, local media belonging to Houthi militias have denied such accusation, accusing Saudi and ISIS for committing these attacks. In December 2015, HRW claimed that 6 unlawful airstrikes were carried out in the capital by the Saudi-led coalition in September and October, which killed 60 civilians. They also criticized the United States, a party to the conflict, for refusing to investigate the attacks. In January 2016, local sources in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a reported that a Saudi-led coalition airstrike targeted the Noor Center for the Blind. On October 8, 2016, a Saudi-led airstrike on a funeral ceremony that killed roughly 100 people and injured 500, including children. HRW is calling the attack an apparent war crime. In November 2017, U.S. Senator Chris Murphy accused the United States of complicity in war crimes and the humanitarian crisis on the Senate floor, stating there is a humanitarian catastrophe inside this country, that very few people in this nation can locate on a map, of absolutely epic proportion. This humanitarian catastrophe, this famine, is caused, in part, by the actions of the United States of America. On August 28, 2018, at a Pentagon news conference in Washington, U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said that the U.S. would continue to support the Saudi-led coalition. In spite of a commitment by Saudi that everything humanly possible would be done and no damage to innocent lives would be caused, the increased civilian casualties in Yemen war remain unexplained. UN's first report after the coalition claims this to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis, where more than 10,000 have been killed. The report also claims that the governments of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Yemen, may be responsible for war crimes, such as rape, torture and use of child soldiers. Refugees. Djibouti, a small country in the Horn of Africa across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait from Yemen, has received an influx of refugees since the start of the campaign. Refugees also fled from Yemen to Somalia, arriving by sea in Somaliland and Puntland starting 28 March. On April 16, 2015, 2,695 refugees of 48 nationalities were reported to have fled to Oman in the past 2 weeks. According to Asayam Hafiz, an Indonesian student who was studying in Yemen, Al-Qaeda of Yemen has rescued at least 89 Indonesian civilians which trapped in the conflict. Later on he arrived in Indonesia and he told his story to local media. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, reported in August 2015 that a total of almost 100,000 people fled Yemen, especially to regional countries, like Saudi Arabia and Djibouti. In September 2016, UNHCR estimated displacement of 2.4 million Yemenis within the country and 120,000 seeking asylum. Evacuation of foreign nationals from Yemen. The Royal Saudi Navy evacuated diplomats and United Nations staff from Aden to Jeddah on March 28, 2015. Pakistan dispatched 2 special PIA flights to evacuate some 500 stranded Pakistanis on March 29, 2015. Several UN staff members and Arab diplomats were also evacuated following the airstrikes. The Indian government responded by deploying ships and planes to Yemen to evacuate stranded Indians. India began evacuating its citizens on 2 April by sea. An air evacuation of Indian nationals from Sana'a to Djibouti started on 3 April, after the Indian government obtained permission to land 2 Airbus A320s at the airport. The Indian Armed Forces carried out rescue operation codenamed Operation Rahat and evacuated more than 4,640 overseas Indians in Yemen along with 960 foreign nationals of 41 countries. The air evacuation ended on April 9, 2015 while the evacuation by sea ended on April 11, 2015. The United States has assets in the region, but through its Yemen diplomatic mission website, instructed its citizens to evacuate using Indian assistance. A Chinese missile frigate docked in Aden on 29 March to evacuate Chinese nationals from Yemen. The ship reportedly deployed soldiers ashore on 2 April to guard the evacuation of civilians from the city. Hundreds of Chinese and other foreign nationals were safely evacuated aboard the frigate in the first operation of its kind carried out by the Chinese military. The Philippines have announced that 240 Filipinos were evacuated across the Saudi border to Quezon, before boarding flights to Riyadh and then to Manila. The Malaysian government had deployed 2 Royal Malaysian Air Force C-130 aircraft to evacuate their citizens. On 15 April, around 600 people have been evacuated by Malaysia, which also comprising other Southeast Asian countries' citizens such as 85 Indonesians, 9 Cambodians, 3 Thais and 2 Vietnamese. The Indonesian Air Force also sent a Boeing 737-400 and a chartered aircraft to evacuate Indonesian citizens. The Ethiopian Foreign Ministry said it would airlift its citizens out of Yemen if they requested to be evacuated. There were reportedly more than 50,000 Ethiopian nationals living and working in Yemen at the outbreak of hostilities. More than 3,000 Ethiopians registered to evacuate from Yemen, and as of 17 April, the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry had confirmed 200 evacuees to date. Throughout April, Russian military forces evacuated more than 1,000 people of various nationalities, including Russian citizens, to the Chkalovsky Airport, a military airbase. Impact on citizens. Children and women. Yemeni refugee female and children are extremely susceptible to smuggling and human trafficking. NGOs report that vulnerable populations in Yemen were at increased risk for human trafficking in 2015 because of ongoing armed conflict, civil unrest, and lawlessness. Migrant workers from the Somalia who remained in Yemen during this period suffered from increased violence, and women and children became most vulnerable to human trafficking. Prostitution on women and child sex workers is a social issue in Yemen. Citizens of other Gulf states are beginning to be drawn into the sex tourism industry. The poorest people in Yemen work locally and children are commonly sold as sex slaves abroad. While this issue is worsening, the plight of Somalis in Yemen has been ignored by the government. Children are recruited between the ages of 13 and 17, and as young as 10 years old into armed forces despite a law against it in 1991. The rate of militant recruitment in Yemen increases exponentially. According to an international organization, between 26 March and April 24, 2015, armed groups recruited at least 140 children. According to the New York Times report, 1.8 million children in Yemen are extremely subject to malnutrition in 2018. Both the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis were blacklisted by the UN over the deaths of children during the war. In 2016, Saudi Arabia was removed from the list after alleged pressure from Gulf countries who threatened to withdraw hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance to the UN. The decision was criticized by human rights groups, and the coalition added again in 2017 and was accused of killing or injuring 683 children, and attacking many of schools and hospitals in 38 confirmed attacks, while the Houthis were accused of being responsible for 414 child casualties in 2016. Education. The civil war in Yemen severely impacted and degraded the country's education system. The number of children who are out of school increased to 1.8 million in 2015 to 2016 out of more than 5 million registered students, according to the 2013 statistics released by the Ministry of Education. Moreover, 3,600 schools are directly affected, 68 schools are occupied by armed groups, 248 schools have severe structural damage, and 270 are used to house refugees. The Yemen government has not been able to improve this situation due to limited authority and manpower. Some of the education system's problems include not enough financial resources to operate schools and salaries of the teachers, not enough materials to reconstruct damaged schools, and lack of machinery to print textbooks and provide school supplies. These are caused by the unstable government that cannot offer enough financial support, since many schools are either damaged or used for other purposes. Due to warfare and destruction of schools, the Education Ministry, fortunately, was able to send teams to oversee primary and secondary schools' final exam in order to give students 15 to 16 school year certificates. Currently, the UNICEF is raising money to support students and fix schools damaged by armed conflicts. Residential condition. The Yemeni quality of life is affected by the civil war, and people have suffered enormous hardships. Although mines are banned by the government, the Houthi forces have placed anti-personnel mines in many parts of Yemen, including Aden. Thousands of civilians are injured when they accidentally step on mines, many lose their legs and injure their eyes. It is estimated that more than 500,000 mines have been laid by the rebels during the conflict. The Yemen army was able to remove 300,000 mines planted by the Houthi militia in liberated areas, including 40,000 mines on the outskirts of Marib province, according to official sources. In addition, the nine-country coalition led by Saudi Arabia launched many airstrikes against the Houthi forces. Between 2015 and 2016, more than 1920 civilians have been killed, and much of the civilian infrastructure for goods and food production, storage, and distribution has been destroyed. Factories have ceased production and thousands of people have lost their jobs. Due to decreased production, food, medicines, and other consumer staples have become scarce. The prices of these goods have gone up and civilians can no longer afford them for sustenance.